Hello, and welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. Art and education are both labors of love. Each requires a passion for communicating information to diverse audiences and/or learners. Inside and outside of the classroom, art serves as a framework for understanding and expressing our lived experiences. Another reason that the arts and education are well matched is that the development of emotional intelligence is something that can be qualitatively assessed through both disciplines. Emotional intelligence is defined as the ability to understand and manage our own emotions and feelings, as well as being able to recognize, understand, and respond to other people's emotions and feelings. Because the arts are both individual and collective expressions of culture and the human condition, studying art can lead to a more comprehensive observation of our surroundings, as well as a more empathetic understanding of one another. In the 1960s, artist and educator Joseph Beuys put forward a concept that he called social sculpture. A social sculptor is anyone who creates an artistic experience within their community through social interactions, collaboration, and physical objects or environments. Beuys elaborated on this theory by asserting that every human being is an artist, a freedom being called to participate in transforming and reshaping the conditions, thinking, and structures that shape and inform our lives. The concept of social sculpture has progressed into a full-fledged movement called social practice art, which seeks to make contemporary artistic processes accessible to everyone, as well as promoting mass participation in creative projects. Social practice is a collaborative, often participatory mode of art making and involves people as the medium or material of the work. Because of this, social practice art often deals with elements that affect everyday life and is extensive in the ways it combines education, art, and activism. At its core, social practice art works towards a shared, socially engaged goal, and through collaborations between artists and members of a community or specific populations, it raises awareness and encourages conversations about specific sociocultural issues. In many cases, these kinds of artistic endeavors also seek to improve physical or psychological conditions. Artistic immersion offers us the agency and ability to become active learners, expressive communicators, and determined problem solvers. This is why including art as a core subject in school is an obvious choice. Not everyone will or should become professional artists. However, they can employ elements of artfulness and artistic mindsets in their daily lives in order to succeed in many circumstances beyond art making. The phrase, "everyone is an artist," is a great mantra to prompt us to become mindfully intuitive and responsive to the world around us. My guest on this episode is Jeff Kasper, who is a social practice artist, educator, and cultural program director. Jeff creates pedagogical tools, text-based projects, social spaces, publications, exhibitions, community education, and workshops. Oftentimes, these artistic and educational initiatives are in direct and democratic partnership with community-based and nonprofit organizations, as well as the community at large. As a skilled graphic designer, Jeff combines the tools and techniques of graphic design with participatory learning and contemplative practices to examine the dynamics of social support, proximity, and safety. His practice has consistently engaged questions around how people build community and practice care and collaboration, especially through trauma, conflict, and crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jeff Kasper to the program. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Adam.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. The good part of Zoom, getting to see people that we don't always get to see.
It's nice to do these because they are over Zoom, and nice to do it with people who are inspiring and friendly and using it for these purposes, right? Not corporate, whatever.
Totally. Totally. I totally agree.
Yeah, so thank you for joining me on this. I've wanted to delve into your work on the blog for a while too, and still want to do that, find an opportunity to feature your work through the lens of the blog and what I do and write about on the blog. The blog part, it's kind of more theoretical. I think it's a little maybe more academic than these audio series episodes, which is why I started doing the audio series, to kind of make things more accessible for different types of learners. So that's always something that is of interest to me, is growing an audience of diverse learners. So in the tradition and spirit of kicking things off Artfully Learning audio series style, I'd like to begin by getting some insight into your artistic development. So one of the questions I love to ask is, growing up, what were some particular instances, either in formal education or through general life experiences, that prompted you to pursue both art and design?
Awesome. I love this question, and I don't often get it, which is sounds weird as being someone who is working in the arts in many different hats. But I would there's a few kind of really formative experiences for me that I carry with me, until today. I think if you ask like some of my family members about whether or not Jeff was going to be an artist early on, you would definitely hear stories of me like taking things from the trash and reusing materials to build kind of spaces and objects for as play objects. And so that would be what my family would say, which is has a level of truth to it. But I would also say, growing up, I was really interested in like extended periods of role play and play in general. I guess all children are, but in particular, what stuck with me is how like friends and cousins and neighbors would often come to me and say like, can we like do that thing we did again? like, this sort of extended, there's characters and sets and sort of roles we would play. And I think back up, on those experiences, and it's kind of very similar to the type of work that I do now, kind of creating social spaces for participatory learning and social support. So yeah, those are some kind of origin points. I've been lucky enough to have art education my whole life, both in school, sort of formally, but also studying with mentors from a very young age. And I feel like for me, art was always like the only path forward. It allowed me to sort of have a sense of agency in my life. And I would also say, so I grew up in somewhat of a sort of faith-based community, and I was a peer minister when I was younger. And a lot of my work carries sort of these sort of contemplative or spiritual traditions merged with art and service. So it's sort of things I've been doing since I've been really little. But yeah, hope that makes sense.
It definitely does. And that's why I love asking that question, because it really does put things into perspective. The lovely thing about art is it's not a linear discipline, as we artists and facilitators of art know. But at the same time, there is this developmental sense that puts things into perspective later on. So those games play. And it's amazing that you're saying, your cousins and your neighbors and friends would come to you as the person who was facilitating these games. You were initiating the playful activities and extending play, as you mentioned, which I had similar experiences, actually. Friends of mine, we were a small group, and we would actually do role-playing games. And one of the games we played was educational based, like we ran a school. And it was like this ongoing thing, both in actual school, we'd be playing this game, and then outside of school too, on the weekends after school. So it was kind of like this very meta game, but also it makes a lot of sense looking back at it. Now, I didn't really think of it until you mentioned, how play was formative in developing, this aesthetic sensibility, and also pedagogical sensibility of bringing people together. Because yes, it's very much both this idea of just free. You mentioned agency. It's very much this idea of having agency to create and develop your own play structures, but there's also this form of bringing people together and cooperating and listening to other people's ideas and getting feedback and creating these whole worlds based on that. It's this democratic process, which is amazing. And hearing you say that that was your beginnings makes a lot of sense with the work you do now. So that's why I love asking that question, because we would probably not have gotten that insight. And that's a testament to how play is really important. And it's something to encourage while we're developing, in all senses of our development, both in school and out of school. So yeah, that being said, I'd like to shift to your current studio art and graphic design practice and learn from you about how your inquiry-based art and design endeavors relate to theories and methods of participatory learning, because you mentioned participatory learning specifically, and experiential education. So perhaps you could start out with a bit about what art-centered participatory learning means to you and some of its tangible outcomes with regards to the work you make.
Yeah. So, I really feel like a lot of times the learning process is, so different for so many people. And one sort of through line or sort of approach that I feel like has worked sort of engaging multiple different types of learners or audiences or publics is really sort of creating more of a horizontal structure where I'm less of the sort of center of or sort of arbiter of the information or sort of the one that sort of has all the say in on the topic we're addressing or in the information being shared, but more so creating structures or facilitating structures for folks to be sort of the center of that, right? Creating moments of interpersonal exchange and being able to really share knowledge more on a one-to-one or within a group structure rather than having to sort of rely on one center source of knowledge. So for me, participatory learning really is the only kind of learning that works. So I am also interested in like ways that my projects can facilitate both direct learning and indirect learning, or direct participation or indirect participation. What I mean by that is, are the games or installations or public art that I create, can that facilitate connections between people without me there? And also, can it be something that is sort of directly used in someone's life, I guess? As you mentioned at the beginning of this question, I sort of vacillate between art practice and design practice. And a lot of the reason for that, besides my education, is both in these, in many areas of creativity. But I feel that art offers an opportunity to sort of bring the symbolic into the conversation, where design also may be able to do that, but really is geared towards use value and immediate utilitarian need. So I like to kind of fuse those things, because I feel like projects can both be symbolic and really important sort of centers for meaning making for both the artist and audience or public. But I also feel like that our projects can also have a life beyond the meaning making and the sort of symbolic dimensions. Like they really can do the things that they are. So we could dig in deeper with that, but that's how I would start.
That's a great description of how it lives on. You want to create something that lives on after it leaves the studio. That's the aim that I think that we all should recognize as artists or designers or creative people, is that letting go of it and bringing it out there in the world to be viewed. And most of the time, that's where we delineate between art and design. As you mentioned, does have this history and foundation in being useful, utilitarian, and art, on the other hand, also had a utilitarian purpose in its origin. I would argue that art, being the oldest form of communication, was definitely useful and utilitarian and had purpose and meaning. And you mentioned earlier your own artistic origins was very much communicative, and through play there was a spiritual element too behind it. You delved into that as well. There was influenced by your upbringing and the community around you, and that was very much the origins of art, as we know.
For sure.
So somewhere down the line, of course, art for art's sake came into play, right? And then separated art and design. And then there have been periods throughout history where artists and designers have tried to blur those lines again. And as makers and creatives and artists and designers, there really is not this line or this rigid definition that maybe the critics or other people in the arts and design world that are outside of the actual making of objects and experiences put onto it. So for us, we're just so involved in it, we don't really see that, or we're not really aware of that. At least that's my sense,
I
coming
agree.
from both an art and design background as well. So that's interesting talking to you about it. It's the similar zeitgeist, and I know other colleagues of mine too would feel the same way. Clearly, art and design belong together, and the elements of art and principles of design are the fundamental principles that we learn in any K through 12 art curriculum and most undergrad studio courses. However, once we get further into professional training for careers in the fine arts, we are often told to make clear distinctions between visual art and design. As well as I mentioned, throughout the course of canonized art history, there's been this debate about art versus design, which is largely theoretical and oftentimes nonsensical. But nevertheless, we're trained, maybe more so in MFA programs and beyond after we graduate, with this formalist mentality that puts art on a pedestal and eschews design if we're going the fine art route.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my experience personally. And then as an educator, I've even had some students initially, when sort of the first few weeks into the course, they're initially griping to me that art has no usefulness in the real world. So that's like something common to students who are coming into it. Mm-hmm. The goal is for them to leave with the understanding that, yes, art is both useful in the real world and also a worthwhile endeavor in school and out of school. So I try to do that by making it relevant and collaborative, like we'll hopefully discuss from your own experiences as an educator working with students from very diverse backgrounds. So I have sort of a three-part question related to your practice in that sense. So can you recall the moment you realized that art and design could be an agent of transformative change and care? Well, maybe we'll just start with that one. I can then go into the other two.
Oh, wow. This one is there's probably so many ways to address this. Going through my own healing processes in my life through traumatic situations that have occurred, I really kind of leaned on the art and design process. And in order to really unpack and process and also connect the dots and sort of try to reintegrate or create a holistic picture of where I am, which is, I feel like, what a lot of people, how a lot of people come to sort of art practices or projects, which is maybe something that we don't talk about in educational context, right? Because we're always thinking about the professionalization of art. But yeah, honestly speaking, I feel when I really understood that these skill sets around problem solving and on visualizing information and bringing people together in order to sort of talk through tough concepts, using visual language and sort of principles of, in my case, like two-dimensional design or communication design, to express and also to collaborate, I feel like was really formative, right? So I would say there's many ways I can answer this question, but really in peer support contexts, in healing and recovery processes, that's when I really understood, oh, I actually can integrate art with both my personal growth and my professional growth. And that there's a way to use these skill sets to not only be in service of projects that maybe have a sort of financial or commercial quality, but also have a personal and interpersonal and a social benefit. So yeah, peer support groups were really that I've participated in my whole life in different capacities and for different reasons. And the way that art shows up for myself and for others in those spaces, I feel like, is where I really see the sort of buds of the transformation we're talking about.
I mean, that leads me to the next question. Your approach. How do you approach? Let's talk about your public art first, because it's something I got to experience in the Rockaways.
Amazing.
Your installation Soft Spots, which was part of Not a Monolith. Is that what it's called?
It was called Not a Monolith, which was a program from ArtsBridge and Meta, and It was sponsored by New York City Department of Parks and Recreation.
And your piece was in the Rockaways,
Mhm.
on the boardwalk, on Rockaway Beach Boardwalk. So I would like to talk about, because your practice is so varied and so focused on so many different things, which I love, because obviously it makes it very accessible for people who learn differently and experience objects differently and interact differently and socialize differently. It takes all of that into consideration. But with your public art and what you do to promote participatory learning, it's especially interesting to me, because sometimes, public art can often have this process that the public doesn't really see behind the scenes.
Mhm.
We experience it afterwards. Sometimes we see the artist making the work, but in general, public art, it's sometimes it's like it appears there overnight, and then it's in the community. And through the lens of participatory and experiential learning, I think there's this push and pull with the idea of making art in public, because your practice especially is very much intrinsic upon having people learning throughout the process and developing each step of the artistic process. Once you have your general idea, it seems like you're working backwards towards assessing and making changes. So it's you're going through this very social and collaborative process throughout the way. So I wanted to talk about how you approach a public art project through the lens of an artist, designer, and educator, and maybe with an example from the soft spots installation or anything else from recent or past history that you might want to elaborate upon, how that fits within your philosophy of care and collaboration.
Yeah, so public art is such a great opportunity to exercise or practice different forms of democratic processes. It could be both like a case study in the worst ways to conduct a democratic process or the best ways, right? So in different projects, having a shared organizational history working on producing public art projects, we know that what goes into them, right? So coming to this project as an artist, I really wanted to have the artwork be at the center as sort of like an object lesson in really understanding how we can approach an artwork from different perspectives and how it can be part of our learning process or a sort of meaning making process for the audience at different kind of points. So the project itself composed of a 300-foot sort of floor or ground mural installation. There's text and there are colors and sort of circles that shift in size. And there's also an audio component, right? So that leads you through sort of a guided meditation as you may sort of move throughout that path on the boardwalk. From an exhibition point of view, all of those decisions are really intentional. Choosing to have text that can be read in multiple directions, having something that is really colorful, that really draws attention. The audio guide is really an extension, but also sort of part of the work. And it's just, for me, they're both the same thing, right? So these are all different ways which we can build audience or address different ways in which people learn or want to or can engage in art, right? So you may be drawn to color and scale and sort of the sort of beauty of viewing. You might be drawn towards the what you sort of glean from the texts. You may be understanding the project at a deeper level through the audio. Maybe you're through the audio, and maybe you're a non-visual learner and you're using the audio in that way. So there's different sort of touch points. Along the development of that project, to speak to that dimension of your question, there's lots of processes that went into creating that work. As part of a larger series about the ways that Black artists are working in New York City and how that manifests in public art. It involved early on speaking with people who live in New York City and Queens through workshop. So I held an initial workshop at the Queens Museum. And I often create workshops sort of in the beginning of a process, not necessarily always within a community design framework, like you and I are going to like make the decision to create the next thing. I do that sometimes too. But in this case, the workshop was really geared towards like kind of having a group think about collective care and using art materials. In this case, we were during sort of real sort of deep isolation in the pandemic. So we did this online, but really thinking through some concepts of collective care that then inform or I use and I translate into, different steps of the process. So I think artists can work sometimes more like like a designer or more like we would do in community development, where it's like every sort of consensus oriented, everybody's decision manifests in the work, or they can work as a translator and sort of processor of the community's sort of input. And that was definitely the case for Softspot. This was a project that happened on public land, it's city owned property. So having to engage with parks department and the city and understanding what's feasible and what is sustainable and what the community board felt was appropriate. Like all of these are really important dimensions that I like to talk about that engage people in the process of the art making. And in the case of soft spots, I also worked with, and particularly the soft spots installations cited in Rockaways that you mentioned. I worked with youth in the area and with an organization called Rise that I've actually worked with in the past. They create programming around resilience, both environmental and sort of personal resilience. And it was a perfect opportunity to really engage young folks, high school age folks around the project and also how they can do similar things in their own lives. And so that became sort of an extended learning opportunity where we're sharing skills about how we create public art proposals, and we're actively also, reflecting on kind of key themes that matter to people in the room. And so I like, projects that have these different touch points, right? There's a process of development that's collaborative, but also there's different opportunities for people to engage, and that there's not only one way to engage with a work. So
I love that you said all that, because that's what I was thinking when I was at the work, rather experiencing the work, I like to say. When I was viewing and experiencing the installation, I was thinking of it in terms of both an artist and an educator, and how that made me feel and how I would go experience it through each of the different facets of my own identity. And, also witnessing people, especially young children, interacting with it is a treat, because, yeah, they do. As you mentioned, there are so many different ways of interacting with the work of art. And maybe some people didn't even know that it was a work of art.
Which I love. That's my favorite part when that happens.
Yes. And I think it's a success when that happens too, because then you get to witness it through this perspective, that it's just part of the fabric of the city or the environment that it's in, when people are just thinking, oh, this is here now. It wasn't here yesterday, but it's here now. And so it must be here for a purpose. And it's fun and colorful and very big and varies in scale. And some people, the way it's set up, the different circular elements to it, make some people think back to childhood games like hopscotch or street chalk drawings in art. And that's some of the memories that I got from the formal and aesthetic elements of the design. I loved how it plays with scale, because that's something we grow up playing games that are intended to develop our motor skills and also help us think and recognize space and spatial relationships. So it does that on this very formal aesthetic pedagogical level, but then also on a more experiential level. I mean, really, it helps us to slow down our day-to-day pace. We're looking at what's written on these circles. We're taking the time to look and to listen and also interact with others who are interacting with the work of art, whether it's friends or strangers. So we're potentially meeting new people and also extending our play with both familiar friends and new neighbors. So that speaks to, I think you would say, the participatory learning framework.
For sure.
And also, of course, as I mentioned, we're honing our deep observational skills by looking and listening, our critical thinking by taking in the formal aspect of the work. What does it mean? How does it relate to our own experiences and the experiences of others? And then you mentioned something too, that the variation of the different pathways that people can choose in how they're coming to the work and where they start, where they finish, or where they come back to. So that speaks to this idea of desire paths, a word I love to use in education, and something that basically means choosing your own aesthetic and experiential adventure. So I really think, I mean, your work does that well, this whole idea of choose your own adventure. And I think that the framework behind it is rooted in gameplay that prompt us to consider very open-ended questions or prompt us to engage in an activity, both individually and with others. Your overall practice is very involved in all types of artistic habits of mind. The idea of that art can help us to pace ourselves better, to take the time and to hone in on our different sensory qualities. And I think that also speaks to accessibility, which is a core part of your work, and care, which go hand in hand with accessibility, making art and artistic experiences accessible. So I wanted to touch upon that with you because you're involved in so many things that I come across, like Art Beyond Sight and Social Practice Queens, different types of socially engaged art endeavors, and forming guides and curriculum that seek to make art and design accessible. You have been working towards creating spaces for various voices to both express themselves and to interact with works of art. An example is, as I mentioned, your work with Social Practice Queens to develop one of the first and foremost pedagogical studies and programs for social practice art. And maybe social practice art is something that a lot of people listening are not familiar with, and it's very hard to describe too. So maybe one of the things that we could talk about is to get your insight into what social practice is and what it entails. And then to follow that up, your current role as undergrad director at UMass, where you're constructing curriculum that is inclusive of a myriad of creative efforts and doesn't delineate between art, design, and participatory activism, which I think would be really great to get your perspective on and experiences from how you work on curriculum and both the theoretical aspects of it and then the methodologies and the actual implementation of social practice within educational environments and the public at large.
Yeah, I guess we can start with this sort of question about what is social practice or what is socially engaged art. The sort of easy answer is socially engaged art is art that is actively looking to, speak to or intervene in or bring dialogue around social topics, right? So that's kind of the broad way of thinking about it. There are social practice artists that work in community contexts. There are social practice artists that create public artworks. There's collectives that are working on sort of shared endeavors. But for me, social practice really is about considering relationships as an artistic media. And that may sound strange for some folks, but I really do think about how we convene, how we communicate, how we organize in space as a form, and also as a material, just as we think about painting, like, acrylic paint, or in sculpture, steel or metal. So I believe that social practice artists are working on understanding how the social is constructed in their particular, whatever project or context that they're working on or with or in. But yeah, for me, it's really considering, relationships as both material and form. And with that in mind, it's really important to be considerate of other people, to understand or have to really reflect on sort of the ethics of a situation, to understand, who can participate in a process like this, and how we can sort of make that more inclusive or equitable. Because we're dealing with building relationships, we have to then, really move at the speed of relationships. So a lot of work happens outside of what we traditionally think of as studio work, right? Conversations, building opportunities for people to connect, to create a shared vision around whatever we're working on, whether we are transforming a park or community space, or whether we're, making a public artwork that looks like an artwork together, or whether or not we're coming together in developing a space where people learn collectively, right? So it's really about relationships. So I have been working in collective and for as long as I can remember, in addition to my own independent work. So you've named a few laces and sort of notable examples. I had the opportunity to both be a student and administrator and faculty member at Social Practice Queens, at Queens College, and which is now Social Practice CUNY, and working across the city. And that was a project that was developed as a collaboration between Queens Museum, the Queens, and Queens College, so a college and a museum. And there's so many people involved in that, and I had the opportunity to really be mentored by faculty like Gregory Shillette and Chloe Bass, and had the opportunity to work with them as the curriculum was developed. There, I got to work with the directors, throughout that process, which really opened my eyes to the way that we can form learning communities within somewhat rigid structures, like a public university, honestly, right? How can we support artists who want to work in the public or with community interests in mind, in collaborative methods or participatory methods, or methods that engage with other fields like environmental science or urban planning, to name two. So really figuring out how to sort of carve out space in an institution to do that, how to leverage the different sort of values that working in between a museum space and a college, and the public, how can that, inform an educational experience? So, a lot of the work really revolved around preparing artists to understand sort of the history of this type of work, to understand how to manage projects, to understand how to really focus on a research interest that you're embedded in, or that maybe interacts with, your lived life or your life in community. So, that's an ongoing project, and Social Practice CUNY is continuing new pathways forward, and now working with artists across the city, and at different City University of New York campuses. I learned a lot from working and studying at Social Practice CUNY, and as I moved into my current role as assistant professor and undergraduate program director at UMass in Amherst, Massachusetts, I started to see how there is a way in which we being the sort of the field of art educators in higher education, as well as the institutions of higher education or art schools, there's a way in which we've been teaching artists over the 20th century, really, that we've been, sort of we inherited a model that that we're really now starting to kind of outlive, and sort of want to sort of move out of the structures and confines of. And that's the sort of case where I am now at UMass. We're reimagining the curriculum for the bachelor's of fine arts program, so that students can really direct their study. And maybe that involves fine art, maybe that involves design, maybe that involves, service learning and civic engagement, or maybe it means all of those things, and to create a pathways that allow for that kind of flexibility. So, work that I've done as an organizer, as an administrator, and within in nonprofits and within higher education really is like kind of prepare me to do this really long game restructuring of curriculum. And we're at a great place where we're pretty far along in the process of, very soon we'll be able to sort of offer this new curriculum. What I learned is that, I always knew institutions move very slowly. But what I learned through my experience and how it's informed this particular endeavor in curriculum design is, really needing to understand, like, the big ideas that we bring are really important, but we also really need to understand how systems operate. Because, for example, changing curriculum, I work at a major public university that serves all of Massachusetts. Many students are coming from Massachusetts, other places too, but mainly the Commonwealth. And, a public institution, we can say tomorrow we're going to change the curriculum, but there are so many systems in place that rely on it staying the same. And I feel like a lot of time the revolutionary act is understanding the infrastructure and the processes that curriculum is sort of maintained or sort of is enmeshed in order to be able to actually make that transformative change. So that's something that I've been doing for a number of years, is really learning, why do we have these kinds of classes in sequence, and why are schools around the state complying with this decision making, and if we changed it, how would what we do in one institution actually influence a whole state, frankly. So there's a lot involved, and I have really appreciated, as someone who's come from sort of the organizing point of view, to actually meet the infrastructure and bureaucracy point of view, because they really can speak to each other in order to sort of create change that is more sustainable. And that's where I'm at right now. On a sort of course by course level, I love to merge design projects with community engagement. And my students are working, they've worked with youth, they on design thinking projects, and some are currently working with doctors and parents and psychologists on inclusive media projects. So I think that there's a way in which art and design education can prepare us for being active citizens, and that, in my opinion, is actually maybe even more critical than preparing an industry for industry alone. I think there are more transferable skills of becoming an active, engaged citizen that you can bring to other places in your life, including how to make a living. But I think we should start there for sure.
I love that you said that. I mean, and I totally agree. And of course, the foundation of artfully learning revolves around that whole concept, because I don't want art to be in service of anything,
right,
other than itself. Like, art as a discipline in and of itself is an impulse. It's a human impulse. We all have it in us. And what you are describing and what your work really helps us to do is to get back to that natural impulse, that playfulness that we had as children, that ability to extend play outside of traditional play structures, playgrounds, play facilities, recess time. The ability to bring that into all aspects of our life is what it means to be artful and to think artfully. It's something that when I was speaking with one of my professors in art education, Linda Lewis, she would always say something that I mean, it's profound because it's in my head to this day. She would say, we're not training people to be artists. And I mean, that was one of the first things that was told to us in the art education program at Brooklyn College, the graduate program. So our goal, especially K through 12, is that we're not training artists. Probably 99.9% of the students coming through those classes are not going to go on to become professional artists in the industry, but the whole idea of, and this is why art is so important, that it's part of the core curriculum in K through 12 schools, is that the habits of mind, these studio habits of mind that often get referred to as ways of thinking and doing artfully, it basically just means living with purpose. And that's the
Right.
thing. When she told me that, she said, we're helping people get back to that idea of living purposefully through making art, viewing art, discussing art, having these experiences, these collaborative and individual moments of self-expression through the act of making things. And that's the core of what the human condition is. And that's why, to me, it makes sense that art is ingrained in the fabric of society. And we, as art educators, instead of training people to be part of the industry or the quote unquote academy, we are facilitating people to hone their artistic inclinations and inspiration, whether it's through materials based explorations or socially engaged or social practice based efforts, to work towards making contributions to everyday life, quotidian experiences. So people like Joseph Beuys, with his idea of social sculpture, this utopian idea that everything is art, a work of art within a social sculpture includes a human activity that strives as this structure to shape society or the environment that it's in. So an artist who creates structures in society through language, thoughts, actions, and objects. Beuys is someone who was an artist and educator as well. And I personally find his work as an educator more profound and interesting. And he even said being an educator was his best work of art. He went against the academy by saying things like that. And what you were just describing too, it's like we have to find ways within these pre-established structures of schools, often because they have to fulfill the curriculum, the blueprint. You have to abide by certain things, and they're put into place because they do have some pragmatic reasoning behind it and sensibility, and especially with curriculum. But at the same time, the arts teach us never to be complacent about anything. And you speak to this a lot. I know that you're an advocate for artists to explore the possibilities within pre-existing conditions and structures, to challenge things and to work within those settings to make it more focused on care and love and things that you wouldn't often associate maybe with institutions like schools or galleries and museums. But you're making artwork and design that speaks to the traditional histories of contemporary art and design, but it's infused with this idea of radical love, and also putting intimate objects in a gallery or prompting people to have intimate social experiences in gallery spaces, and just looking at relationships in a different way, in a way that's more receptive to how we would treat our close friends and family. Through art, you're envisioning these things. And I think that's one of the things art does well, is that it can envision a better society. For me, the beauty of art is that it actually puts the concept of what a utopia is in a way that becomes sort of tangible, because we can see it through the vision of the artist and those who are working with the artist and viewing the work. It prompts us to consider, well, yes, a better world is possible. Better relationships are possible. I don't have to be stressed all the time. I can enjoy this beautiful experience or this beautiful environment that's being depicted in the work of art, or that is being alluded to or suggested. And it reveals itself through these participatory processes that you were discussing, and how some of your students are taking that profound vision that artists have to portray this better world or this more inclusive environment. And then they're working in different fields, of collaborating with doctors and other industries or disciplines, with the bringing ideas of compassion, radical love, care. Studies have shown that, especially in the medical communities, hospitals, doctors' offices, wherever, things where there definitely has to be procedures and structures. But when you bring art and artists into these environments, it also helps to show that we also need to consider the humanity behind it and the autonomy of people. and everyone deserves to be valued and cared for and to be able to express themselves. And art helps people communicate. And I know you do a lot of work about pain and trauma too, and how it's often very hard to communicate. And perhaps we could speak to that a little bit. How do you assess and reflect on big ideas and enduring understandings regarding how art enables individuals and groups to contribute to their community, practice self and communal care, especially when responding to trauma, conflict, and crisis?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. There's lots of ways that I can speak to this. I would say in general, based on my own life experiences, and observations, I really come to kind of live a sort of trauma culture, live through, what it's like to have chronic illness, what it's like to experience traumatic situations and the impact that has on your health. And that like lived experience, that embodiment, and also being a queer person is really important within this mix, and a person of color. How this sort of embodiment really informs the aesthetics of our work, and how that we should keep that in mind, when we're talking about our work, but also when we're analyzing our work. Coming from these lived experiences, I really spent a lot of time and continue to spend a lot of time to develop really frameworks of working that are trauma sensitive. So, I feels like weekly I'm in some kind of class, usually outside of my discipline of study, really learning about how the brain works, learning how health is sort of determined by so many different kinds of factors. And what I'm really looking to do is to translate that into information and frameworks and tools for people and artworks for people to be able to integrate that information into their lives. So there's a lot of disciplinary silos, the medical space, for example, perhaps is not always the most welcoming space. Yet there is information in those fields that inform medicine that are really important for people to know and to live and to understand. And I really work hard to create projects that unpack some of that information, as well as literally, frankly, provide ways to access that in your own life, right? So, and I do this mostly through in my artworks and experiences, but also in the resources and publications and workbooks that I put out on this topic and continue to work on. So a trauma informed or trauma sensitive framework or a healing centered framework is really at the core of everything I think about, whether that's creating an art object like a sculpture, or whether that's creating like a pedagogical environment or a workshop or experience. So grounding our space in transparency and trust, identity affirmation, really creating places and situations that are empowering. These are all really important elements to being a trauma informed person or contributing towards trauma informed practices or cultures, as I like to think about them. Because there are so many ways that people experience pain, move through trauma and crisis, I really want to meet people where they are. And in a lot of my artworks, I center personal experience, the personal, in order to move to a universal by getting really specific, not on my personal trauma or my personal situation specifically, but like how that's impacted the way I think about things. Being really clear about that really gets a lot more people sort of magnetized towards this, not just this artwork, but this sort of concept. So I find that the more that you're able to sort of engage with the personal in your practice, the more the universal kind of interpretations there can be. I have been, advocating in a lot of spaces for disability justice spaces and disability art across the disability arts ecosystem. I feel that it's important for us all to be able to engage in being an artist and also engage in viewing art and experiencing art. So I'm like always reading and experimenting and building new ways that people can literally touch or engage the work, access the work. So being a visual artist, it's difficult because you're sort of catered to one particular sense. So bringing in the experiential, the non-visual, the tactile is really important. And I try to create projects where people can go and hide in my artwork. There are places to rest and hide. There are places where you can have that interpersonal exchange if you're ready. There are structures for consent that are built into this work. Like my card games are all oriented around really understanding how to dialogue with another person while considering sort of the element of consent. So these are all accessibility concerns for me. Creating spaces that are lowly lit, some of my artwork has braille, right? So understanding that there are so many layers to accessibility and that we may not be able to fully embody accessibility, but we can live accessibility as a practice of love and a practice of doing better and a practice of supporting each other. And if I could do that in my work, I feel like I can sleep nice.
Well said. I do agree. I mean, it does put you in this relaxed state when you're talking about dealing with so much anxiety and all the situations that we go through. Life for many is not so rosy, but the arts have power and the potential to at least help alleviate some of this anxiety that is both individual and shared. Hearing you just describe the various ways in which you think and work as an artist and how your journey as an artist working with so many different populations and communities has shaped how you have an understanding on the world. That speaks to that whole idea of art as an act of living purposefully or helping us to reclaim purpose and meaning. That when people are experiencing a lot of trauma and feelings of hopelessness, to have a space where they can express those feelings. I mean, I really appreciate the work that you do to suggest that this is a possibility within the art world. And the art world wasn't built in a day, and it's not going to change in a day. But these types of proposals and these types of endeavors plant the seed for how it can change and how it can be more inclusive. I really think that's what we all should want to strive for. When you think about what art is, it's self-expression. People often use the word beauty in terms of art, and not all art has to be beautiful, but it's such a powerful expression of our human experiences and our human condition that it should be a springboard to then explore human relationships more, explore ideas of this shared humanity. And I like what you said. This is a quote from your Instagram. You said, sometimes engaging in a shared humanity simply involves acknowledging the points where our anxieties intersect and committing to support the areas where they depart. And that's such a profound encapsulation of what it means to have human relationships and what it means to live purposefully. And as you described, this is where, as we're coming together to create and express, it's best when we go through this healing journey together, and facilitating it through artful practices and education is something that makes a lot of sense, because we can envision better possibilities, which can then be passed on to people in fields like science or technology who can take those visions and work alongside artists to actually bring about new treatments or ways to combat climate change or work to create more sustainable communities. But that whole mindset has to really start with the idea that we should live with purpose, and the arts embody that philosophy. The whole idea of social sculpture, right? Making the artistic process accessible to everyone, not just the people who are in the industry. It's when we talk about educating artists, we should have to maybe rethink what that means. Do we want to commit to keeping art as academy-based, or do we want to promote mass participation in creative projects? There's really two divergent paths where the arts and art education can take us. I mean, I, of course, like the one where we're promoting mass participation in creative projects, as I'm sure you do. And I mean, you're clearly facilitating that in your own work as an artist and educator. So if we can conclude this conversation on a optimistic future of where we're headed. What do you see as the pathway forward? How do we get to that path where everyone can feel comfortable in sharing moments of participatory learning through the arts? How do we make that a reality? How can we use art to structure and shape the society and the environment that we all deserve to live purposefully in?
Love that. I love ending on a positive or future forward note. The first thing I would say is that we need to remember that artists exist in all aspects of society and that art is not separate from society, not separate from culture. It's part of everyday life. And I think my kind of dream is that artists can really openly work as artists in any discipline. Right? They can work in medicine, they can work in education, they can work in construction, they can work in whatever, openly as artists, and that would be valid. That would be a valid path because I really feel that that's what artists do actually natively, but the systems which we have created have alienated us from that and also created these divisions and created art as its separate discipline. So I really believe that artists should be embedded in every aspect of life. And so that would be my general my general suggestion for future. And I really do see that happening in so many ways in which other spaces that are not typically engaging with the arts are integrating art and artists into the field. And there's pros and cons to the practices, and it's being done great in some spaces and not so great in other spaces, right? But really making sure that we embed artists in all aspects of society and social life. I also really feel that, especially in the visual arts, as a discipline that is primarily built around creating this sort of fantasy of the lone artist genius, and I feel we need to let go of that because it's not actually even true. And really acknowledge that artists' livelihoods and careers are made or broken by their network of support and the way in which they work cooperatively with others, artists or non-artists. And we really need to be educating artists in the visual arts and design along the models of cooperation, because in reality, we talked earlier about the process of creating public art as one example, but in reality, artists are always engaged in dialoguing and interfacing with other people, whether you have your own studio or whether you're working for a design firm, whatever, you are interfacing with many different types of people: publics, students, companies, vendors, fabricators, bureaucrats, institution systems. It's all oriented around being able to engage with others. And I feel that there's a lot of opportunity for us as artists and educators to really recenter the reality that we are a collective society. We need to be collectivizing. We need to be creating work together, and that we can't, and that be working in collaboration doesn't mean the loss of personal vision or autonomy, but the balance between autonomy and interdependence, right? But being working with others, also protecting yourself, being able to negotiate relationships, build social networks. And I don't mean like Facebook or Instagram, but like, engaging with other people and building relationships of support. That's what makes art happen. And if we don't reorient our teaching to that, we are going to continue to reproduce this myth that art is exceptional. And I love the idea that art is exceptional, but in reality, art is how we make sense of our life, and it's integrated to every sort of the everyday experience. And I like to imagine, that art can just be something that's part of our lives that we don't have to really rarefy.
What's exceptional is life itself, the fact that we're all here. and that we can have relationships with others, and that we can create art, whether it's individually or with others. That to me is phenomenal. Facilitating the participation of everyone in the artistic process is something that I've seen we're moving towards it in both the institutional art world and in art education. There's still work that needs to be done, but the idea of the collective and the participatory learning through art is something, you mentioned is happening and needs to continue happening. We don't live in a bubble. Our art won't even flourish if it's just made that way, with the idea of this genius. It's isolating. That whole idea of genius is so isolating, and it's the antithesis of art and education, in my opinion. This whole idea of prodigy, what we're doing when we consider someone a prodigy, can be shattering. Of course, later on, sometimes that leads to a lot of feelings of self-doubt and isolation. And the whole idea is we're working out of this period where we were sort of forced into isolation and social distancing. And we need to envision a future where we can practice care and remembering how just that brief period made some of us feel. Some very vocal people were not happy with how that made them feel. Think about, though, the isolation that certain people feel in the disabled community on a daily basis prior to 2020, prior to social distancing as a collective notion. These are the day-to-day experiences certain people have to face. My hope was that the fact that we were all forced into this period of social quarantine where we couldn't be in schools, we couldn't be in museums, community spaces. My hope was that it would have led to a quicker transformative change and zeitgeist throughout collective culture. But the idea remains that the foundation is there. I think that there's a lot of potential to get to that position where we do realize this sucked for me during this brief period, but other people live like this constantly. This is a constant struggle people are going through. It's not going to kill me to change some behaviors that I have to be more cognizant of other people's experiences. And how do I practice, or how do I live my life in a way where I'm feeling fulfilled, but also acknowledging and caring for others? Life is the exceptional thing, and finding ways to do that is the art. It's been great hearing you talk about that and learning more about your work in design and fine art and activism and care. Thanks again, Jeff. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been great to chat with you.